Here because I'm originally from Argentina, and we Argentines like to talk a lot, so I'm going to keep this to remind myself to be relatively brief. So, thanks again, Emerge. I've been obsessed by this question that Spiro just mentioned for many, many years. Why do some countries grow more than others? Why do some people prosper more than others? So, why is it that in Latin America we create the best soccer players in the world, Lionel Messi, singers like Shakira, writers like Garcia Marquez, like Vargas Llosa, and we cannot produce one single world-class innovator of the capacity of the reach of a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg.
Pero ahorita tengo unos problemitas técnicos que estoy tratando de arreglar.
So to answer this question, I went all over the world. I went to Silicon Valley several times, New York, Boston, China, India, Israel, Finland, Korea, South Korea, Singapore. I went to all the main centers of innovation of the world, and I interviewed some of the world leading innovators, including, you name them, Richard Branson, the Bill Gates, Salman Khan, the social innovator who started the Khan Academy, Chuck Hull, the inventor of the 3D printer, many other people I interviewed over the past couple of years. And the question I wanted them to answer is the one that Spiro just asked. Why is it that some countries prosper more than others? What can we learn from them, from each of their stories as countries and as individuals? And I arrived at 12 conclusions, which I cite in my latest book, Innovative Dies. Some of you have it, courtesy of Emerge Americas. I arrived at 12 conclusions. I'm not going to bore you with all 12 of them, but let me share with you 2 or 3. The first and foremost conclusion I reached after interviewing all these people in all these places is that, especially in Latin America, we do need a reality check. We need to realize that we're far behind and that we need to get out of this culture of complacency we're living in. Latin American presidents are used to saying that the countries are doing great things in innovation, in education, and that's fine, it's their job. It's their job to sort of elevate the self-esteem of their people, to promote their countries, that's fine. The problem is that it's not true. If you look at the real figures, we have a real problem. And in Latin America, all the polls show that people are convinced that their countries are doing well in education, in innovation, which are the engines of development in the 21st century. There's a very interesting poll done by the AIDB, El Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, that asks people all over Latin America, how satisfied are you with your public education system? And 85% of the people in Latin America say, very much, we are very satisfied. People think that their education systems are good. Whereas in Japan, in Germany, in many other countries that have much higher quality education systems, the number of people who respond that way is much lower. So our first order of business is to realize that we're not doing as well as we should. When I interviewed Bill Gates, and I asked him this question that we're talking about now, why is it that some countries prosper more than others? He told me something really interesting. He told me that, first of all, it's education, he says. He was lucky enough to go to a good high school that allowed him to get in touch with one of the first computers, etc., etc. But then I asked him, and it was funny because it was a TV interview, we were in front of the cameras, and I asked him, okay, but why Paraguay has also great schools, private schools for very few people, but they're great schools. Why hasn't Paraguay created a Bill Gates? And he sort of was a little bit taken aback by the question, but then he told me something that I found very, very interesting. He said, the countries that do best are the humble ones. And at first I didn't understand what he meant. And some of you might be thinking, what is this, an Argentine talking about humbleness? That's absurd. But anyway, it's him talking, not me. So he said, the countries that are doing best are the countries that are always fearful of being left behind by others. What I call the paranoid countries. And it's totally true. And he said, for instance, in the 1960s, this country, America, was obsessed with the fact that the Russians were doing much better in the aerospace business, when they sent the first satellite. So the US started investing in NASA, sent the first man to the moon, and caught up and surpassed the Russians. Afterwards, the Americans were obsessed with the Japanese. They're passing us over. Now we're obsessed with the Chinese. So in this country, there is something I call positive, productive paranoia. We need some of that. And what he said is totally true. When I went to China and interviewed the people at the education ministry in Beijing and asked them, what do you guys do to get in the first places of the PISA test, the test of 15-year-old students? And one of the high-ranking officials, I don't remember whether it was the education minister or the number 2, told me, well, we're not doing really that well because the PISA test measures Shanghai, which is one big city, but it doesn't measure all of China. We still have 800 million people living in poverty getting very bad education. You should go to India. In India, they're doing things very well. So I went to India, not immediately, of course, a couple of months later, and I interviewed the Indian Minister of Education. And I asked him the same question. What are you guys doing to do so well in education, to have an innovation center like you have in Bangalore? What's your secret? And the Indian education minister tells me, Andres, I'm very flattered that you came to us, but you should really go to Singapore. These guys are really doing the best thing. And I went to Singapore 6 months later, and while I was waiting in the waiting room to talk with the education minister, there was a crew and a journalist from CCTV, the Chinese network. And I asked them, what are you guys doing here? And he says, well, we came here to interview the education minister because Singapore has the best technical vocational institute system in the world, and we want to learn what they're doing well. When I go to Latin America and I interview education ministers, they tell me, oh, we're doing great. We're the best in the neighborhood. Our universities are sending people to NASA. Our physicians are doing great in Houston, etc., etc., etc. So the first thing we have to do as countries is realize where we are. And if we look at where we are not doing that well. If you look, for instance, at one measure of innovation, creativity, if you look at the patents, patent registrations in the US, which is the biggest market in the world, many of you, most of you are entrepreneurs, are innovators. If you come up with something new, with something hot, first thing you're going to do is register it in this market. So, last year's figures, US inventors registered 140,000 patents. 140,000. How many did South Korea? 18,000. Germany, 16,000. How many did all 33 countries of Latin America register? Take a guess. Close, caliente, caliente. All countries of Latin America registered fewer than 1,000 patents in the US registry. Mexico 172, Brazil 323, Chile 75, Argentina 66. With 500 plus million people in Latin America, we produce 5% of the patents registered by one little Asian country, South Korea. 5%. So we have a problem. We're among the countries in the world that invest the least in research and development. Japan, South Korea, and Israel invest 4.2% of their GDPs in research and development. Japan, 3.5%. Finland, Sweden, 3.3%. Taiwan, 3%. How much does Latin America invest? Again, how much? I wish. I heard one here, 1%. 0.5% is the average. Brazil is the only one that invests 1%, 1.2%. All the rest, 0.4, 0.3, 0.4. Again, South Korea, Israel invest 4.2% of their budgets, of their national economy in research and development. Latin America, 0.5. So, what should we do? Number one, realize that we are far behind. Get some of this paranoia constructiva, this constructive paranoia that this country has and others, and the Chinese have, and the Indians have, and many others have. This is like Alcohólicos Anónimos. This is like if you have a drinking problem. If you have a drinking problem and go to Alcoholics Anonymous, they're going to give you 12 steps. The first step is recognize that you have a problem. If you don't recognize that you have a problem, you're not going to get anywhere. Second thing we need to do as countries and as individuals is to create a culture of obsession with education. The Asians have it, we don't have it. I was just in South Korea 2 weeks ago, and I went to, I was doing research for my forthcoming book, and I went to a high school, and I just talked to one 17-year-old student and asked her, which is I do always, every time I go to one of these Asian countries, I do the same exercise. I ask kids to tell me about a regular day of them. So this 17-year-old student told me she woke up at 6:30 in the morning, went to school at 7, studied until 3. From 3 to 8, she went to a different school, to a private institute to improve her qualifications to get to a better university. In other words, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And then I asked her, okay, so when do you do your homework? And she says, well, after dinner, usually until 11:30 midnight, sometimes until 1 p.m. Our students, you know, start watching TV at 3 p.m. and that goes for the US as well. So we have a problem. We need to create a culture of national obsession with education. It can be done. I'm not going to dwell into this because I want to finish talking about innovation. But basically, I'm very impressed with what some countries are doing. For instance, in Brazil, there is a movement called Todos pela Educação. In Mexico, there is a movement called Mexicanos Primero. And the concept is that to improve a country's education system, you have to go from the bottom up. People expect education ministers, governments to solve the education ministers. My friends, that's never going to happen for a very simple reason. Governments think in 4-year terms, in electoral terms. Education, improving teacher quality, improving principals quality is a 20-year program. And presidents, no matter how well-meaning they are not going to invest in things that don't appear in the picture. They're going to perhaps invest in a school, in a building, in a hospital, in a bridge. But they're not going to invest as much as they should in teacher education, in principal formation, etc., etc., etc. To improve our country's education systems, we need movements that go from bottom up, like the ones I just mentioned, because, as I said in a previous book, la educación es algo demasiado importante para ser dejada a los gobiernos. Education is too important to be left up to the governments. We have to create civil society movements of business people, academics, journalists, to get together and put pressure on governments to adopt very concrete and very well-defined education programs. Third and last thing we should do as countries and as individuals, especially in Latin America. Because when I started working on this book, on Innovate or Die, I asked myself the question, why didn't we create a Steve Jobs? Why is it that Latin America hasn't created a same thing I asked when I posed the question to Bill Gates? And one of the most fascinating things about Steve Jobs' story is that the guy was fired from Apple when he was 30 years old. And he showed up, his picture was in all major magazines and newspapers, you know, fired. In our countries in Latin America, if you're fired, if you appear in one of the main magazines saying, you know, you're out, man, you're gone. We have all kinds of expressions for it. You know, fuiste, se quemó. You're over. You're history. In this country, not in this country, I should say, in Silicon Valley, which is a very unique culture within this country, Steve Jobs started raising money for his next project, got millions and millions of dollars, and he would later describe this as the most productive part of his life. So, every single of the top world innovators I interviewed in this book told me the same thing. Success is the last link of a long chain of failures. They all fail many times. You heard that several times. In this country, more and more we start to understand that. In Latin America, we need to start understanding that. We need to create a culture of collective tolerance for individual failures, because every single innovator I talked to of these very successful people told me again and again and again how many times they failed. And this, by the way, is nothing new. It has always been like that. Thomas Alva Edison, you know, the guy who invented the light bulb, 1,000 failed attempts before he came up with the first successful light bulb. The Wright brothers, the pioneers of aviation, 163 failed attempts before they did their first successful flight. They would take off, you know, fly a couple of feet, and then the plane would crash. 163 times. My favorite example, Henry Ford, the pioneer of the car industry. He made 19 failed attempts before he came up with a Ford T model. He started with a Ford A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Some biographers dispute the story, but some others say it's true. It took him 19 prototypes to get to the Ford T. In Latin America, we need to create a culture of collective tolerance for individual failure. And finally, fourth and last of the 12 that I won't mention, but the fourth I want to mention is that we need in Latin America, and this is very important because this is something we don't have at all, we need to create a culture of veneration for innovators. This sounds pretty simple, but it's not. Because in Silicon Valley, one of the things that most impressed me every time I go, but I start pretty much the book with this anecdote. One of the first time I went, I was in a cocktail party and I started making small talk with people, and I asked people, what do you do? And people would tell me, well, I'm doing a new startup. I did 4 startups before, I failed, but this one will do very well because of this and that. I mean, they volunteered their failures. In Latin America, people will die before admitting that they failed in anything. We need to create a culture of social tolerance for individual players, and we need to create a culture for veneration of innovators so that our young people want to become innovators. Because in Latin America we have 100 million boys who want to be the next Messi, and we have 100 million girls who want to be the next Shakira, but very few who want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next Bill Gates or the next Steve Jobs. Fortunately, there are growing numbers of individual innovators in Latin America who are having an economic impact. In my book, I start with one that doesn't have anything to do with technology. A cook, Gaston Acurio. Any of you from Peru here? Okay, you know who he is. A Peruvian chef who started, I'm winding up, who started doing cuisine, Amazonic, prehistoric cuisine, did his restaurant, and then instead of staying with his own restaurant, he started sharing his recipes. Instead of doing what cooks do, supposedly the cook takes his recipe to his deathbed, he started sharing it, created a movement. He gave his recipes to his competitors. He said, we are not, no somos, nosotros no competimos, nosotros compartimos. We don't compete, we share. And he turned Peruvian cuisine into a movement that today is one of the most successful cuisines in the world. Today he has his restaurants all around the world make more than $100 million a year. He has created a school of restaurants. There are 500 Peruvian restaurants in New York. So he created something that didn't exist only 10 years ago and turned it into a major source of income for his country. I'm going to cut it here. I'm going to leave the other Latin American success stories that I mentioned in the book. But summing up, it can be done. But Latin America needs to create a culture of obsession with education, a culture of collective tolerance for individual failure, and a culture of veneration for innovators, so that instead of having 100 million kids wanting to be the next Messi, which is okay with me, we should have many more. But not only Messis, we should also produce the Mark Zuckerbergs and Steve Jobs of this world. Thank you very much.
Andrés Oppenheimer, thank you very much. He's also doing a seminar on write a book and see the world, which is what you did, right? Okay. Coming up next, what we're going to do is discuss this and take it one step further. The Minister of Modernization